42-year-old Brigadier General William Tecumseh Sherman was the only one of Grant's 6 division commanders at Shiloh with a West Point education. He'd entered the academy at the age of 16 and was roommates there with fellow future Union General George Thomas. It was there at West Point that he first met many of the men he would later fight with and against, including a friend he knew as Sam Grant. He was a brilliant student, and he probably would have finished in the top 5 of his class if it weren't for all the demerits that he received, because he hated the discipline, the neatness in dress, and the strict rules of the military academy. He served in the military like many of his fellow cadets for many years after the war, but by 1859, on the suggestion of Don Carlos Buell, Sherman had accepted the position as superintendent of what is now Louisiana State University. He was very popular there and by all accounts was very good at the job. But when word came of South Carolina's secession from the Union, witnesses say that Sherman burst into tears and began to pace back and forth. A friend from the South who was present said that he then went on a tirade about what a terrible ordeal was sure to follow. He called it a crime against civilization and said that while the North would eventually win the war because of their superior manpower and resources, the country would be drenched in bloodshed. Sherman resigned from the school and headed to Washington, D.C., where his younger brother John had just taken office as a United States Senator from the state of Ohio. When President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, Sherman said that he may as well be attempting to put out the flames of a burning house with a squirt gun. Sherman accepted a commission as a colonel and ended up commanding a brigade at the First Battle of Bull Run. He was grazed there by bullets across his knee and his shoulder, and by all accounts performed well in a battle that went very badly for the Union. He was given promotion to brigadier general that was backdated to May of 1861 and sent west to Louisville, Kentucky in command of the Department of the Cumberland. There he began to complain about the lack of adequate supplies and manpower and about the strength of the rebels that he would be forced to confront. Negative reports began to appear about him in newspapers, and by November he asked to be relieved of command. He was replaced by Don Carlos Buell, transferred, and eventually was found unfit for duty and placed on leave. By all accounts, including those by his own wife, he appears to have suffered a severe mental breakdown and even contemplated taking his own life. But within a few months, he had recovered well enough to return to duty, and by March was in command of a division under his old friend from the academy, Sam Grant. Now, as Grant's army assembled for the eventual move on Corinth, Sherman's 5th Division was assigned to camp here, near the Shiloh Church, along the road that led directly to the Confederate Army, just 20 miles away. Sherman's division was given a location to camp around this small church that was, by the time of the battle, about 10 years old. It was known as Shiloh Church. Shiloh being a Hebrew word in the Old Testament meaning place of peace. And so it's ironic that the battle began on a Sunday morning, a battle named for a biblical place of peace. Sherman's headquarters was just maybe 100 yards from the church at the time, and his men had been here for about 3 weeks when the battle began. They heard the fire to the south of here, signaling the skirmishing that began the battle. And Sherman and his men began to stir, but Sherman didn't initially believe that there was a major Confederate attack underway. There had been skirmishing with Confederate pickets a few days earlier, and nothing came of that. So there was no reason for Sherman to think at that point that there was a major engagement. And besides that, because of the mental health issues that Sherman had dealt with in his prior assignment, he was a little bit reluctant to overreact to something. And so he hadn't had his men digging any kind of defensive position here in the weeks that they had been here. He didn't want to be seen as paranoid, which was the reputation that he was getting. But he went out to investigate and very soon found out that it was a major Confederate attack by about 40,000 rebels. In 1851, a man named John Ellis donated land to the Methodist Episcopal Church here for construction of a house of worship. And this structure, pretty much as you see it today, was constructed on the site. It was destroyed not long after the battle and eventually rebuilt around 1875. Now, over here is the present Shiloh Methodist Church. This structure was begun in 1929, but because of lack of funds was not completed until the 1950s. And it remains an active house of worship to this day, including the modern cemetery. I thought this was pretty cool. Here in the cemetery at the modern Shiloh Church is, among other people, Leonard Ray Blanton, who died in 1996 and was a state representative, a U.S. congressman, and governor of Tennessee. Now, the church that you see here today was only completed in 2001 on the site of the original. It was built with logs that were cut down from the local area of trees that were over 150 years old. It was built using the same tools and the same way of building that would have been done at the time. And so it's about as faithful a reconstruction as you can possibly get without being the original. Colonel Jesse Appler of the 53rd Ohio had a knack for really understanding the situation. The day before the battle, on April 5th, he had responded to some of the contact that had been made between skirmishers from the Confederate and Union forces by sending an outpost forward of his position, sure that there was a main body of Confederates behind it. That outpost eventually fell back when the battle began south of here, and Appler responded immediately by putting his men into line of battle, some of the first troops in Sherman's command, to prepare for the oncoming Confederate onslaught. At least 3 different times he had to shift the facing of his 53rd Ohio to face the Confederates as they came through the woods. That was when General Sherman finally rode up and understood exactly what was happening. Up until about 7 a.m. on the morning of April 6th, I think a fair assessment would be to say that General Sherman got pretty much every decision and every assumption wrong. He wrongly assumed in the aftermath of Fort Henry and Donelson that the Confederates were in disarray and falling back and disorganized and on the verge of collapse. He wrongly assumed that reports of fighting in his front to the south of him were just skirmishers by patrols and didn't represent a main body of Confederate troops. But that all changed at around 7 a.m. on the morning of the battle. Sherman had ridden out to observe the 53rd Ohio's location, and he had pointed in the direction of what he saw as some Confederate troops when he was wounded in the hand he was pointing with. Right about that same moment, an orderly sergeant that was near him took a bullet to the head and was killed instantly. And it seems like something clicked in the mind of William Tecumseh Sherman. He shouted, "My God, we are attacked!" And he rode over to find Colonel Appler and told him to hold his position and that Sherman's entire division would come to his support. And from that moment on, William Tecumseh Sherman started making all the right choices. So a little orientation for us here looking at this map. The Confederate attack came from that direction. The first shots of the battle were fired over in that direction. Once that skirmish was complete and the Confederate advance came forward, then they came at Sherman's division in this location. The Shiloh Church and Sherman's headquarters are just through these woods. You can kind of see it right through there, down a little ravine and then up. So Sherman's headquarters was there. And the Union line then came from there and then curved around right over here. And so right in this area where we are looking, you can see where we're at is where the Union line curved around. And so you can figure if you are at the apex of that line, which is where the 6th Mississippi was, you're potentially facing fire from two sides. And that's exactly what happened to the Mississippians in this field. Put yourself in the position of a soldier in the 6th Mississippi. You're fighting pretty close to home. We're only about 10 miles from the Mississippi border, so these men aren't fighting that far outside their home state. But the vast majority of these men have never seen combat before. And now they find themselves in one of the deadliest spots in what will become at the time, by far, the bloodiest battle in American history. These young kids are watching their friends go down all around them. They end up taking 70% casualties in this beautiful field, which is one of the most picturesque locations on the battlefield. They were being fired at from multiple sides. They're attacking through broken terrain, uphill, thinking they have the element of surprise. They've been urged forward by their commanders, and they're being cut down just as quickly as they can go. One of the reasons that I love to visit battlefields and that I love to bring you these battlefield videos is that it's impossible to really understand a battle until you actually visit the location and see it for yourself. And there's no better example of that on the Shiloh Battlefield than here, looking across this creek in the direction of Shiloh Church. As the Confederates attacked, this is what they were facing. They had to cross this body of water under fire from Union soldiers who were on high ground. They had to go through broken terrain that had clearings and then trees and then marshes and then more bodies of water. They were attacking uphill the entire morning and afternoon. And though they had the element of surprise initially, eventually they faced a determined opponent with organized, effective defense. It was an impossible ask for men, most of whom had never seen combat before April 6th. We are kind of toward the left of Sherman's division as he moved them into position. The 53rd Ohio was still fighting desperately against the lead elements of the Confederate attack there in the field in the distance. And Appler's men performed nobly, but it was a no-win situation. They were just completely overwhelmed. And once the Confederates were able to get to within 50 yards of Appler's position, they unleashed deadly volleys, and Appler gave the order for every man to basically run for his life. And that's what they did. And that began a ripple effect that caused Sherman's initial line to fall back to the higher ground that we see here. And what the Confederates continue to face is uphill and through woods, which continues to break up their lines and cause brigades to intermingle. And so there were constant shuffles having to be made by the Confederates in terms of what command they had. And in many cases, the Confederate generals would just take command of whatever troops were in front of them, whether they were a part of their units or not. But where we're facing now would have been the area defended by the 57th and 77th Ohio regiments, facing off against the right flank of Patrick Cleburne's brigade. Specifically, the 5th Tennessee would have been coming through this area here. While the fight for the area around Shiloh Church was happening, General Johnston had ridden to the front to direct the attack from that location, which left the other 4-star general in the Confederate Army, P.G.T. Beauregard, in charge of commanding the troops as they moved into battle. And so as the wave after wave of Confederate forces moved forward in this major frontal assault, they should have been directed to the Confederate right. Remember, Johnston's battle plan was to turn the Union left, drive them away from the Tennessee River and toward the swamp, toward an area they couldn't retreat through. But Beauregard, in the rear, is funneling the reinforcements to the sound of the heaviest fighting. Well, that was here, where Sherman's defense was just incredible. And so Sherman is personally leading his men. He is riding around and making all the right moves. He's directing well-placed artillery fire that is tearing holes in the Confederate attack. The Confederates are having trouble because of the terrain, because of the confusion of battle. But eventually, something had to give. Because of the confusion of the Confederate attack that morning and the effect that it had on the Union forces, Sherman's left flank had never been able to link up with the forces to his east. And when those forces were driven back, Sherman suddenly saw that his left flank was now out in the open and was about to be hit by the Confederate forces being directed by Johnston. And so after about 3 hours of putting up a heroic defense in the area around Shiloh Church, Sherman had no choice but to order his men to fall back. But as would be the case many times during the day here at the Battle of Shiloh, his men had slowed the Confederate attack and bought precious time for the organization of a defense further to the north. This is such an interesting microcosm of the fact that this was a civil war right here. This is the monument to the 2nd Tennessee Infantry of the Confederate Army of Mississippi. And just maybe 40 feet away is the monument to the 70th Ohio, which was a part of Sherman's division. And just through that trail on the edge of the woods there would be the Shiloh Church. Because of the nature of the terrain, because of the stubborn defense put up by Sherman and his division, The Confederate losses here were severe. Patrick Claiborne, who commanded one of the brigades attacking Shiloh Church, would later say in his report on the battle that Tennessee could never mourn a nobler band than the men of her state who fell here attacking the Shiloh Church. There were acts of heroism on both sides. There were severe losses on both sides. And if there's any place that was really an indication of just how vicious the fighting would be throughout the 2 days here at Shiloh, it would be the fight around the church that gave the battle its name.